Hey Weasleys, this is Emily and you're watching The Burrow. Today I'm going to show you how I make my drawings go from this to this. Later on in this video I'm going to do a demo on how I actually color one of my characters, but first I would just like to go over how I kind of choose different colors and the process behind that. So this is one of the main characters from the comic I'm working on right now called Kingdom Come. His name is Prince Gil and he changes outfits as do all of my main characters. I don't want them to be like the characters we had in cartoons as kids that just wore the same outfits for years. But for Gil, I want him to have a really royal look. He is a very pompous little prince, so I try to keep that in mind while I'm coloring him. So I start off with the chair behind him. I actually started out with the bronze part of the chair being like a bluish silver, but I decided to change it because the picture overall was looking a little too monochrome. I knew that some of the accessories and upholstery I wanted to be purple, and a lot of what Prince wears is blue. Those are kind of like the colors I've assigned to him and his kingdom. So I made it more of like a bronzy color just to add a lot of contrast. Then I colored in the upholstery and cushions behind him. I wanted them to kind of be muted on the right side by his butt and have the cushion be a bright color up by his shoulder so it kind of leads your eye up to his face. You don't really want the focus to be on kind of lower in the picture on his butt, so that's why those colors are less vibrant. For his jacket, I went with an off-white color. I thought that was still a really royal looking color without it kind of blending into the blue and purples on the backgrounds. I didn't make it a pure white because I tend to avoid using pure whites at all. I don't think that it prints that well maybe, and also just because I don't want him to look too pure, the kind of off-white color is kind of more representative of his character, I think. I also added gold for the tassels on his shoulder. I think gold is pretty obviously a standard royal color. You'll notice that I also made the tassel on the cushion a different type of gold. It's more of a bronze color than the gold on his shoulders. I just like using slightly different variations that way, and then it doesn't look like you only had like 4 crayons to color the whole picture. You have all the colors in the world when you're using digital media. So but I also like to keep colors within the same family, so the prince actually only has like 2 color families on him, but I can go more into that. So now I've colored his pants and little belt sash thing. They're actually kind of the same color, just one is much darker than the other, and that adds contrast, but then they're also sort of staying concise by being in the same family, like I was saying. If you add a lot of different color families, I think you should do that out of expression of the character or the piece that you're doing. I really like to keep it concise, especially when you're working with characters on colored backgrounds and you have lots of characters maybe in a scene. It's just confusing to the eye if you have hundreds of different colors going on. And now I've added the boots in. The boots are two-toned, and the boots along with the golden tassels are all in the same family, and the top and pants I believe are all in the same family. So I think that he has a concise color theme going on here, but I think the light part of his jacket will help him kind of pop off backgrounds, and I think it draws the eye well enough, and I like having contrast between the top and bottom parts of characters too. So the next character is Princess Adelaide, and for reasons that will come up in the story, I didn't want her to look quite as royal as Gil, so I didn't give her the same color scheme. I didn't want them to look related either. So I gave her a pretty feminine look in this particular picture. So I got a piece of advice from someone online a long time ago, and I can't recall who it was, unfortunately, but they were talking about how they color things kind of from how the character would get dressed. So I mean, you don't dress your skin per se, but I usually start with the skin and then work up from there. In this case, I might color the back of her fur cape first and then move on up to the top layer of her clothing. For the skirt, I wanted all of the different pieces to look like they were almost the same color, but I just varied them slightly to give it some depth and a little bit of variation between the different panels from the sides and then the middle pleats, and I made sure to make the underside of the pleats behind her feet quite a bit darker to add some depth. I went with gray for her shoes because I didn't want them to be like a bright screaming color. I feel like if you're going to make shoes an insane color, that should lend itself to the story as well, but in this case I didn't want them to be drawing any attention. And I was also looking at some photo reference, and a lot of the shoes from medieval times were black, gray, or brown, so I went with gray. I thought it kind of went with the pink really well. I had a lot of fun with this bodice. I used the off-white sort of theory that I used on Gil here to add some contrast against the darkness of the cape behind her. And I made sure the stripes on the bodice follow the contours of her body and of the fabric. I used off-white again for the owl and the paper behind her hand. Those are also elements from the story, but since I knew the background was going to be white for this illustration, I didn't want them to just be like empty shapes in the background. So you can choose these off-white colors kind of close up near the actual white color, but I usually go from the yellowish hues, and they don't actually look yellow once you lay them down. It's kind of like tricking your eye into thinking they're still kind of whitish, off-whitish. So yeah, I think using those colors kind of in between like a bright red or a bright blue, or pure white or pure black, they can really add a lot of depth to your illustrations. So everything in Adelaide's outfit is kind of within the red color family. The cape is kind of veering more towards a yellowish brown, but they look similar enough, and I kind of like how they're clashing with her hair color. I don't know why. I think I originally set out to color this as purple and green and a bunch of crazy colors, and the cape was closer to black, and it just looked way too dramatic to me, and I wanted her to look more like a soft, like rose looking girl. Yeah, I think that's a stylistic choice on my part, that she has this vibrantly purple hair but it clashes with her outfit. So now I'm going to start coloring this character Tak, the third of the main three characters in Kingdom Come. And I start out by selecting using the wand tool, a big shape, and I'm starting with his skin here like I mentioned before. Then I zoom in and make sure I colored in all the little nooks and crannies that the wand didn't end up selecting. Oftentimes my liner is not completely closed, so like you can see in the hair there's a lot of little points that haven't been selected, so I just have to manually go in and clean those up with the brush tool. Now I'll go in on a separate layer and start coloring in the details of the face. Again, with the off-white color, I usually don't color the whites of eyes a pure white, because I usually do a pure white highlight on top, and that helps the highlight stand out off of there. And I usually color eyebrows a shade darker or just a slightly different shade than the hair. That's how it usually is in real life if you look at people's real eyebrow hair color and the hair on their heads. And again, it's just helping it to contrast. The hair on the head and the eyebrows aren't going to blend in together. Just before this, I was switching back and forth between Adelaide and Tak's designs because I want to make sure they have different skin tones. I remember when I was a kid, I used to color pretty much everyone with the same pencil crayon, and I started to learn how to pick proper skin tones from actual photo reference, and I would drag pictures I found off Google of different people and just use the actual eyedropper to pick their skin tones, and I kind of found where that range was in the different sort of hues they come in. I wanted Tak to have a very earth-toned look and not to have any bright colors on him. He's not a royal character, so I wanted him to look a lot different from Adelaide and Gil. He's always had yellow and green snake arms, so that was a no-brainer for me. And here he's wearing a blacksmith's apron. It's like a very heavy leather apron, and you'll see in the footage that I kind of mess around with the color of that, trying to get it right, which is another perk in using Photoshop and other digital mediums, where if you're not happy with the colors, you can go back and change it pretty easily. Here I'm selecting the front part of the sledgehammer. I'm making it lighter than the other part to add some more dimension and make it 3D. And now I'm messing around with the apron color, and I don't think that's even the final color. It's gonna change again later. For the sake of this video, I drew in a sun just to show where the imagined light source will be. I used to do this when I was first learning how to color stuff, and I still do it sometimes if there's kind of a complicated light source, but it's really important to keep that in mind while you're going in and shading the character. So I've gone in and laid all the flat colors all over tack, and now I will add the shading. I usually do this sort of dark blue shading. I find that it looks the best when you set the shading layers to multiply in Photoshop. I find it looks much more natural than if you use a pure black or brown or some other color. And it also shows up very well when you're painting it on as like pure blue, so you can see pretty accurately where you're laying it down. And then I set it to multiply after I'm done. Something I've been trying to work on recently is just simplifying my shading. It can be tough, especially when you're shading a human character, that you want to go in and make every single strand of hair detailed and all of the lumps on the skin and stuff. But maybe you noticed before when I was shading the skin, I went in and took out kind of where I had put a lot of detail around the mouth and chin and simplified it, and then I did the same thing with kind of the inside of the hair. That almost always tends to look the best. For both Adelaide and Tac's hair, I go in after I do the basic shading and highlights, and I add just a soft brush shadow and highlight. It adds a lot more dimension. Now I'm adding highlights to Tac's arms. In general, I only do this to pretty reflective surfaces. I wouldn't bother putting this on clothing unless it's like a very shiny type of clothing. But like he has a soft looking shirt, so I wouldn't add like a bright highlight to that. Most often I just go in with my brush and paint in by hand where I want the shadows to lay. I've seen some artists who can use the lasso tool and they're pretty accurate with it, but for now I'm just using this technique. In some cases I might use the lasso tool if there's a very large area that needs to be painted in shadow. I feel like I should mention too that I almost always use the style of shading, which I think is generally referred to as cell shading. You just use a solid edge to indicate where the shadows are. And I know when I was first starting out with digital art, I would use the soft sided brushes like the airbrush and stuff to shade in, and that just in general doesn't often look that good, and I would definitely suggest just having the courage to lay down where you want the shadows to be and use a hard-sided brush. It looks a lot cleaner, and you know, if you have confidence, it'll come across visually as well. Here you can notice that I made sure the shadow of the sledgehammer is following the folds and ridges of his apron here. You don't want it to fall down just straight across something that has ripples in it like fabric. That's just not how it works. Since I'm imagining the apron is leather, I'm just throwing down a general highlight with the airbrush and then going in and picking up a brighter highlight with the default brush, which has a hard edge to it. Yep, now I am just going in and changing the color of the leather again. I do like a once over of everything. Here I'm changing some detail on the eyes that no one will see once it's zoomed out. But yeah, once the picture is all done, I just generally go through and change some colors that I think need adjusting. So yeah, that's the way I do things. I learned how to color in Photoshop just by using it. Everyone has their own way of doing stuff like this. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments down below. Thank you guys for watching, and see you in the next video.
Understand why writers keep personal blogs that are just so freaking sloppy. Like, keep the copy clean, right? Treat your work professionally, but yeah, write in your own space about things you're passionate about. It'll be good for you mentally. It's good writing practice. And when all else fails,